لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. My goal in this series of presentations is to show why Islam is true. As I explained in the first presentation, my approach will be to take the statement Islam is true as a claim, and then to evaluate the evidence that supports this claim, as well as the evidence that may argue against this claim. In order to make this evaluation, I need to clearly define what I mean by the word Islam, and I explained in the first presentation that what I mean when I say Islam is true is that it is true that God created the universe, put us in it for a great purpose, and sent us messengers to tell us our purpose so that we might gain eternal happiness in our life after death. In order to evaluate this large claim, I need to break it up into a series of smaller claims, and the most important sub-claim of this large claim is the claim that God exists. In the second presentation, I showed you why it is that God must exist, and we saw that the contingent universe requires a necessary being in order for it to exist. In the next presentation, I explained what I mean by necessary being, what the Quran means by necessary being, what the Prophet ﷺ meant by necessary being, and I showed that the concept of necessary existence is the most important concept that relates to the concept of God, and it is what distinguishes God from everything else that exists. Now, I promised that I would examine the evidence for the claim Islam is true, and also the evidence against that claim. So in this presentation, I'm going to respond to a materialist objection to the claim God exists. In particular, a materialist objection to the argument that I presented in the second presentation for the existence of God. Before I present that objection, let's recap the argument. In very simple terms, the argument goes like this. The universe exists, but it could have not existed. Therefore, God made it exist. It's night, but it could have been day. It's day, but it could have been night. Therefore, God made it night, and God made it day. Ships sail, but they could have sank. Therefore, God makes them sail. It is rainy, but it could have been sunny. Therefore, God is making it rain. Everything in the universe could have been other than the way that it is. Therefore, God made everything the way that it is. It's a very simple and, in fact, intuitive presentation of the argument for the existence of God. The objection that materialists raise against this argument is that this is an arbitrary solution. They say that therefore, God made everything the way that it is an arbitrary solution. And then they say, then who made God? Before we respond to this objection, which you will hear very frequently in contemporary debates around the existence of God, we need to understand what exactly it means, because this objection is often made and its meaning is not carefully analyzed, and until we carefully analyze its meaning, we cannot respond to it and explain why it is an invalid objection. This objection consists of two parts. The first part is the statement that is an arbitrary solution. The second part is the question, who made God? Let's start with the first part of this objection. That is an arbitrary solution. What exactly does this mean? Let's do a quick recap of the argument that I presented in the second presentation. In that presentation, I explained that everything in the universe is contingent. The fact that ships sail is contingent. The fact that rain falls is contingent. The fact that wind blows is contingent. Everything in the universe is contingent, meaning that it could have been other than the way that it is. Since it's contingent, it needs something else to make it true. What a scientist does is he explains one contingent fact in terms of another contingent fact. But that doesn't solve the problem, because the second contingent fact needs a third contingent fact to explain it, which will then need another contingent fact to explain it. We saw that I explained that this series of contingent explanation cannot continue forever, because no contingent fact really explains anything else, because it remains something that needs to be explained by something else. And the only way to explain the existence of the contingent things in the universe is to end the chain at a necessary fact, which I explained in the third presentation is what religious believers mean when they refer to the entity called God. So the materialist who is objecting to this argument is saying that that necessary fact is an arbitrary solution to the problem of contingency. What does he mean by arbitrary? What he means by arbitrary is that there is no reason why ending the chain at a necessary fact, in other words, God, is any better than ending it at a contingent fact. That is why the materialist will follow his objection with statements like this. He will say that, why do you want to end it at God? Why don't you just end the contingent chain at the universe? Or better still, end it at the Big Bang. If you want to end it at something, why choose God rather than the universe or the Big Bang? In fact, ending it at the universe or the Big Bang is better than ending it at God, because God is something that is magical and unscientific. The existence of God can never be demonstrated through the scientific method, and so one should choose something in the universe, and that would be a better explanation of the contingent causation. If you have to stop somewhere, stop at something that you can easily touch, smell, grasp with your mind, something that has evidence for its existence, rather than something that has no evidence for its existence. That's how the objection goes. Now, if you've carefully followed the argument for God's existence, for the existence of a necessary being, and if you've carefully followed my explanation of the objection that is an arbitrary solution, you will quickly see that this objection completely misses the point. It misses the point because the whole point of the argument is that contingent facts cannot be made true by some other contingent fact. To say that all of the contingent facts are made true by the universe or the Big Bang is not a solution, because the universe and the Big Bang are both contingent facts and they need something else to make them true. When we say that God is the one who made all of the contingent facts in the universe true, God does not need to be made true by anything else. That's why he is a necessary fact. The existence of God is not a fairy tale that doesn't have any evidence behind it. The existence of God is a reasoned conclusion. God must exist. If you think, God must exist. If you skipped ahead to this presentation without watching the second presentation, in which I explained the argument for God's existence more thoroughly, go back right now and listen to that presentation before continuing ahead with this presentation. If you did listen to that presentation, then some of you will have grasped why the objection is an invalid, fallacious objection. Some of you, however, will still not have grasped this, because there is an underlying problem that exists in the minds of most of us today. That underlying problem is what I call the fallacy of materialism. The fallacy of materialism reasons like this. It reasons that everything that I observe is material. The sun is a material object. The moon is a material object. The table in front of me is a material object. Rain, stars, wind, everything that I touch and observe is a material object. Therefore, everything that exists must also be a material object. It's because of this fallacy that the objection that we are studying arises. Because of this fallacy, when we observe one contingent fact, and then we go to another contingent fact and another contingent fact, reaching the conclusion that all of these contingent facts must have been made true by a necessary fact. Because of this underlying fallacy in many of our minds, we consider the necessary fact, God in other words, to be a material object, because we think that everything that exists is a material object. The only difference between God and the other material objects in our minds when we have this fallacy embedded within us is that God is somehow more powerful than all of the other material objects. And since God is a material object, albeit more powerful, just like all other material objects, this is what leads us to ask the question, what made God? It is because of this fallacy that the objection that we are studying arises. Since somebody with this fallacy thinks that everything is material, there appears to be no difference between ending the chain at God or ending the chain at some other material object. But what the argument shows is that the fallacy of materialism is a hasty generalization. It's a hasty generalization because it's a generalization that is not only based on insufficient evidence, it's actually based on ignoring evidence to the contrary. We have evidence, the argument is evidence that God is not a material object. Based on evidence, we therefore know the existence of at least one non-material object, and that is the necessary fact for whose existence we have this argument. God is not a material object, and the fact that he is super powerful is not what makes him God. What makes him God is that he is a necessary fact, that he is not contingent, that he is not material. Matter is contingent. God cannot be material. This argument argues from the contingency of the physical universe. The physical universe is the total of all material objects. And when we look at the characteristics of the material objects in the physical universe, everything in the physical universe, all of these characteristics, location, size, motion, matter, or energy, change, time, all of these are contingent characteristics. They need to be made true by something other than themselves. So the physical universe, because it is composed of material objects, is contingent. To say that it's contingent is the same thing as to say that it's needy, which is the same thing as to say that it is dependent. And the physical universe therefore needs a necessary fact, and the necessary fact must be non-contingent. And it can only be non-contingent if it is non-material. The physical universe, from its contingency, from its neediness, from its dependence, points to the existence of a necessary fact that is necessary, which is the same as to say that it is self-sufficient, which is the same as to say that it is independent. And its being necessary, self-sufficient, and independent can only be the case if it does not possess any of the characteristics of material objects, because all of those characteristics are contingent. And that non-material, non-contingent being is what we mean when we say God. And so when we say that God is the solution to the problem of contingency, it is not an arbitrary solution. It is not an arbitrary solution at all. God is non-contingent, non-material, completely different than all of the other material things that we observe and touch. That is why the question, what made God, is an invalid question. We'll return to this question in just a little bit, because this was the second part of the objection with which we began this presentation. What's important at this point is to understand that the necessary fact, the non-contingent, non-material fact, the fact of God, is not an arbitrary solution. It is a reasoned conclusion. And the fallacy of materialism that might lead some of us to imagine that it is an arbitrary solution is a baseless, hasty generalization that flies in the face of evidence to the contrary. Let's return to where we began this presentation. We began with the conclusion from the contingency of the universe that God made everything the way that it is. The objection that this is an arbitrary solution, then who made God, we saw, was composed of two parts, and we've just seen that the first part is a baseless objection that does not advance any evidence against the claim that God exists. Now that we understand why the first part of the objection is baseless and fallacious, we can move on to see that the second part of the objection is also fallacious. The second part of the objection commits a logical fallacy that logicians call the fallacy of multiple questions, or in simpler terms, it's often called a loaded question. A loaded question is like the question, have you stopped beating your wife? This question presupposes another question, namely, were you beating your wife? If the answer to this previous question, were you beating your wife, is yes, then you can validly ask, have you stopped beating your wife? But if the question that is presupposed, were you beating your wife, the answer to that question is no, then the question, have you stopped beating your wife, is an invalid question. It cannot be posed because it's based on an unjustified assumption. If someone insists anyway and asks, have you stopped beating your wife, knowing that you have never beaten your wife, then the proper way to answer this question is to return it to the question that it hinges on, namely, were you beating your wife, and to say that I have never beaten my wife. I have never beaten my wife, and then to say that therefore your question is an invalid question. It's based on an unjustified assumption. Similarly, the question, who made God, is a loaded question. It presupposes another question, namely, does God need to be made? If God needs to be made, then one can validly ask, who made God? But if God does not need to be made, then the question, who made God, is an invalid question. If someone insists on asking anyway, who made God, knowing that God does not need to be made, remember that that's the whole argument that that the presentation in lesson 2 was dedicated to, and that I've explained several times in this lesson. The whole point of that argument is that God does not need to be made. God is a necessary fact. So the question, who made God, is an invalid question. If someone asks it, the proper way to answer it is to return it to the question that it presupposes, and to answer that question by denying emphatically that God does not need to be made, and your question, who made God, is therefore an invalid question. It's a loaded question that is based on an unjustified assumption. So the second part of the objection is also fallacious. Let's return once again to the beginning of our presentation, in which we saw that everything in the universe is contingent because it could have been otherwise. This is proof that God is the one who made everything the way that it is, because God is a necessary being who does not need to be made the way that he is by anyone else. The objection that this is an arbitrary solution, or the question that who made God, this objection is a fallacious objection. It's a baseless objection. It is not based on any evidence, and the argument for the existence of God still stands just as strong as it stood before this objection was made. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل.
لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.